Dragi obiskovalci festivala Indigo, veliko veselje mi je, da danes napovem dva naša gosta. Prvega prav gotovo poznate, Mladen Dolar, filozof, profesor, član in eden izmed ustanoviteljev znamenite Ljubljanske šole za psihoanalizo. Avtor številnih knjig, esejev, strokovnih člankov doma in tujini. Mladen Dolar je reden sodelavec festivala Indigo, že skoraj od začetka, in je naš veliki podpornik in zaveznik, brez katerega si našega festivala ne moremo predstavljati. Mladen Dolar se bo pogovarjal s Petrom Szendyjem. I will switch to English. Peter Szendy is a French philosopher and musicologist. He is the David Hurley Professor of Humanities and Comparative Literature at Brown University. His preoccupation is subject of hearing, or what we hear, or maybe overhear. His books got big attention in the field of philosophy and culture studies, and the last one, titled Supermarket of the Visible, elaborates an economy proper to images, icons, in other words, economy. The Supermarket of the Visible is a must-read for anyone concerned with media, philosophy, politics, or visual culture. I would like to thank French Institute for Culture in Slovenia and its director Karel Kugart for the support. Merci beaucoup. Dear Mladen Dolar and Peter Szendy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Blaž. Thank you for this invitation. It's a great pleasure, a great honor to have with us tonight Peter Szendy. It's a great pleasure and honor for me in particular because we have been friends for many years, but we very rarely see each other, and I really rejoice at this opportunity. And yes, I will just make some presentation introductory remarks to the work of Peter Szendy before giving the word. As Blaž already said, he's a French musicologist and philosopher of Hungarian descent, by the way. And at this point, David Hurley, Professor of Humanities and Comparative Literature at Brown. And he had a PhD in musical aesthetics in the 90s, and was then teaching in Strasbourg for a number of years, and Nanterre, and finally in Brown since 2017. And this is apart from being a visiting professor at a number of places like Yale and Princeton. And actually, the last time we met was actually at Princeton. And he's also a professor at the European Graduate School, where we teach at the same institution, although somehow we never overlapped. I always managed to arrive a day after you left, or the other way around. And apart from that, a number of other appointments, like being musicological advisor of the Philharmonie de Paris and editor of a number of journals. And as to his books, if I counted well, there are sort of 19 publications in French and 8 books published in English and also translated in a number of other languages. And I must just mention there's something we'll be talking about. The first book I'll mention is L'écoute, Écoute, une histoire de nos oreilles, translated into English as Listen, a history of our ears. Then Membre fantôme, the phantom limbs, also translated into English. There is Sur-écoute, esthétique de l'espionnage, translated as all ears, the aesthetics of espionage. And there is Tube, translated in English as Hits, philosophy in the jukebox. And well, the supermarket of the visible that Blaž has already mentioned. We won't be talking about the visible today, taking the other entry through the voice and listening and hearing. And I will mention Pouvoir de la lecture, de Platon au livre électronique, which will be published in English as Powers of Reading from Plato to Audiobooks. And there's a couple more that he has published since. and he's been the editor of volumes and special issues, and most notably the editor of Derrida, Donner le temps, recently, and then monographs or volumes on Bartók, on George Kurták, on Schoenberg, on Lachenmann, a number of composers, and we actually shared the same passions for the composers. Okay, this is the sort of list, a brief list. It could be done in a much longer way, but there are many more. But let me just mention those. And now, if I had to disentangle a common red thread underlying his work, or give some sort of clue as to what is the object of his constant pursuit, I would venture three slogans, or three proposals. Well, the first one, Peter likes to quote and engage with Marcel Duchamp, and you know Duchamp is the one who proposed the notion of inframince, infra-thin, like sub-thin, less than thin. Thin is already tiny, but inframince is tiny beneath the threshold of usual perception, something barely perceptible, or on the verge of unnoticeable, vanishing, but nevertheless persisting. A sort of minimal difference, but which turns out to be nevertheless a difference that makes a difference. And I guess all objects that Peter's work is pursuing have ultimately a certain quality of inframince, infra-thin. Say, listening to one's listening. How do we listen to listening? What does one listen to? And listening to overhearing. Overhearing, sneaking into listening, and eavesdropping, a surplus, listening to the surplus in listening. Or listening to one's reading, the voice accompanying the practice of reading, and actually a multiplicity of voices accompanying the reading. Or say the question of phantom limbs. You know, the phantom limbs, the limbs that are not really there, but missing limbs, but which one nevertheless feels, which is the title of one of his books. What does one feel with the limbs that are materially not there? And by the way, Merleau-Ponty, his Phenomenology of Perception, which is one of the most perceptive books on perception, starts sort of astoundingly not by standard ways of perception, but by considering precisely phantom limbs as the vantage point from which to disentangle perception. And Peter's book on phantom limbs proposes a whole area of organology, the phantom body produced by music, produced by listening, not only ears and voice, but organs extending into prostheses. And actually, as I learned from looking at his CV, there was an exhibition, Phantom Limbs, in a gallery in Paris in 2010, based on his book. And one wonders, what did the exhibits look like? Like, how do you make an exhibition of phantom limbs? And since we will be talking also about reading, actually one of the examples that Duchamp himself gives of this infra-thin, and all the examples by Duchamp are sort of tongue-in-cheek, is how to distinguish the printed lines that have been read by someone from those that haven't been read by anybody yet. There is an infra-thin difference, how to tell the difference. And there is another Duchamp subject, ready-made, which is called With Hidden Noise, which is another possible slogan for Peter's work. Or yet another example of the objects he is pursuing is the melodies that get stuck in one's mind and one cannot be rid of, which is the subject of reflection in his hits, Philosophy in the Jukebox. And again, there was a theatrical piece called The Haunting Melody, based on Peter's books, produced by a theatre in Montreuil. And again, one wonders how to stage the vocal theatre of the mind. I would love to be there to see this production. So this is the first part, the first entry, pursuing objects which are infra-thin, constantly pursuing objects which are infra-thin. And the second proposal would be that the common quality of the phenomena of Peter's research that would come from Alice in Wonderland, from this famous episode of the vanishing Cheshire cat, the grinning cat that gradually vanishes, disappears, until only the grin remains. The grin without a cat, and the grin without a substantial support, an unsubstantial grin. And one has to have special powers of perception to sense this kind of grin, and to hear this kind of grin, to pursue it, how to listen to a grin. And I think, again, all Peter's objects of research seem to me to have this air of the grin without a cat. This could be another entry point into his work. And finally, the third common thread of Peter's work would simply be parallel worlds, which happens to be the slogan of this year's edition of Indigo Festival. And we were wondering how to tie our talk to this slogan of the festival, but we realized that no effort is necessary. Actually, Peter's entire oeuvre could be seen as a terrific endeavor to discover parallel worlds inhabiting this one, sort of alternate realities within the seemingly objective existing entities. Too tiny to be quite present in a verifiable, in an objectifiable way, and hence, well, Peter is the ideal guest for this year's festival. His work is kind of embodying this slogan of parallel worlds. So these are the three possible entry points: inframens, the grin without a cat, and parallel worlds. And I know this sounds rather unspectacular. We'll be speaking about rather minimal entities. And my part is just to give some introductory remarks, some clues, and I will very briefly say just a few words on listening, on eavesdropping, on reading, and finally on rumors. And our works have been constantly overlapping. From my work on the voice to Peter's path-breaking work on listening, and to our recent, as we discovered, common interest in rumors and gossip. And we'll come to this in the end. Now, one could have the erroneous impression that there's like a division of labor. My work on the voice dealing with one part was the emission of the voice, while Peter's work deals with the complementary part, which is reception of the voice, the auditory part. But this is precisely not the point. The two parts are absolutely inseparable. There's no emission of the voice that wouldn't be accompanied at one and the same time by reception, by audition. And there is conversely, and perhaps counterintuitively, the other side, which is the listening that has to be listened to. Not simply listening as a passive stance, but listening that has to be listened to. And this changes everything. Listening as perhaps different from hearing. There's a difference, particularly in French, between écouter and entendre, because the difference between perception and intellectual endeavor of understanding, because entendre means already that we make sense. We understand this faculty of understanding. We make sense of what we hear. But what we are both interested in is precisely the entities that cannot be reduced to making sense. That sense is, or making sense is already like a domestication of the strangeness of listening and of the voice. Now, Peter's book on listening presents a very subtle and perspicacious reflection on listening, not merely as a receptivity, but an activity, an appropriation, the movement of both expropriation and appropriation, the paradoxical movement. Listening is not a private affair, and Peter insists on the notion of listening addressed to another, involving the other, listening as an address rather than a solitary inward process. And I cannot follow the meanders of his delicate argument. I just give you one quote from the end of the book, and where you can also appreciate the flair of Peter's prose. This is the quote: "The listener that I am is nothing, doesn't exist so long as you are not there. There or elsewhere, it doesn't matter, so long as my listening is addressed to you. the listener that I am can happen only when I follow you, when I pursue you. I couldn't listen without you, without this desire to listen to you listening to me, not being able, since I'm unable to listen to me listening. Okay, you see the kind of a bit convoluted paradoxical sentences, but which point in a very precise direction. So to listening as a sort of collective experience or activity, entailing a form of address, a pursuit, and at the same time being unique, being assigned experience, there's a uniqueness to one's listening, yet it's something that should be transmitted. And there is an ambivalence involved in listening. On the one hand, to listen is to obey, to be subjugated to another, and etymologically, obey comes from obaudire, where in Latin there is this conflation of listening and obeying, and also in German, gehorsam and hören. And on the other hand, to listen is to appropriate, to sign, to address the other. And if one speaks so much about the author's rights, the copyright, etc., Peter proposes the notion of the listener's rights. Should listeners perhaps form an organization for the protection of their rights? Anyone's right to no one's property. What am I entitled to as a listener? And what summons me to listen? Okay, the second part of this diptych on listening is called All Ears, which is a kind of wonderful translation of the untranslatable French sur écoute. And it deals with the aesthetic of espionage, of spying. And as he says, spying is the second oldest profession in the world. And you know what the first one is. So this aesthetic of eavesdropping, of overhearing, sur écoute, the additional surplus hearing, which starts from the ear of the other that precedes mine. So that hearing is always overheard, which inevitably leads to the trajectory from overhearing that has always been part of human experience to the present state of surveillance and control, the universalized eavesdropping that we are experiencing, and introducing the notion of panacousticon, calqued on panopticon. And again, I take just a very short sentence from this, from the introduction to this book. This is the quote: "It is as if there were more and more ears, only ears everywhere, even though there are no real ears anymore." Okay, you see the distance between the two. So many ears, omnipresent overhearing that we are faced with in the present world, but bearing witness to the absence of real ears. So there's so much overhearing that the world has become hearing impaired. In the next step, I finish shortly, is the question of reading, and we'll do this trajectory from listening to reading to finally the rumors. And in this book, the last book, Powers of Reading, from Plato to audiobooks, it's a book which deals with reading as a vocal enterprise, a vocal theater, an activity of the voice rather than of the eye. There's the voice accompanying reading, a sub-voice, a silent voice, a sub-vocalization, an inner voice, but which actually turned into plurivocity, the multiplicity of voices accompanying reading. A voice which is not mine, not quite the author's or the text's voice, not my voice, and there is a voice also issuing an injunction to read. It's a quasi-categorical imperative. And there is both it reads, preceding the I read. And there is at the same time the injunction to read, stemming from where? Categorical imperative is part of the Enlightenment, the Kantian sort of bit of it inscribed in the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was the movement which proposed reading as a way, as the royal road of emancipation and empowerment, as a way to freedom, a way to finding one's own voice, and to finding the voice of the oppressed. And so the book examines this presupposition, showing how actually reading has been historically placed in a very complex web of distribution of power, not simply this road to liberty. And again, the book makes a trajectory from what is implied in any activity of reading, in the multivocal scene of reading, to the present predicament, namely the infinite proliferation of texts. The infinite proliferation which is impossible to read. There is a plethora of texts, the hypertextuality, where one is overwhelmed by constant reading on the screens, with the polyphony, the cacophony of text, images, sounds, hypertext. So it looks like there's something a bit anachronistic about the inner voice of reading at the age of this, the era of hypertextuality. And the thesis is that the hypertext is not aphonic. There's a listening to the reading voice, which has to be reinvented in other ways in this era. So the paradoxical situation of being overwhelmed by hypertext, while at the same time the activity of reading is dwindling. The attention span is drastically diminishing. There's like too much reading going on, while reading is drastically declining, the capacity to read. And finally, the last point, just a word on rumors. And rumors can again be seen as an instance of these infra-thin entities. They come from nowhere. There's no assignable originator. They're based on thin air, not verifiable. They don't have a foundation in knowledge, in logos, yet they have effects, and even murderous ones. They are like a barely discernible noise between enunciation and the statement, spreading from nowhere and to no one, or to anyone. They seem to be an archimedium, the originary medium, the permanent rustle of it speaks. And again, there's a trajectory from rumoration going back to times immemorial. There were rumors since ever we remember, to our present predicament, namely the enormous proliferation of rumors through the new media, the social media, defining our horizon of communication, of information. And the question can be posed, is this massive development a further avatar of something present since the beginning, be it as a trembling of a rustle, or does this enormous quantity and speed of spreading introduce a new dimension in the general rumorization? And I will end with this quote by Jean-Luc Nancy, that Peter also quotes in his text, who was asked in 2018 about the proliferation of fake news and the new regime of lying being normalized. And this is a question to both of us, because Jean-Luc Nancy then said, I don't really believe that. I can see it becoming quite widespread, but fake news have always existed. In fact, I don't really understand why there is so much focus on this frenzy of fake news. Why make the fuss? This has always existed. Of course, we live in a world in which the quantity of information transmitted every moment is so enormous that absolutely everything and its opposite circulates endlessly. And from this point of view, social media are just as bad as they are good. They enable very rapid instantaneous communication, and at the same time, they spread anything and everything. So this will be a question we will perhaps have to tackle in the end. Are we in a situation that we have always been in? It defines the condition of humanity concerning rumors. Or have we reached a stage where the overkill of information, overkill of communication and rumorization threatens with disrupting our common experience and basic social ties? So much for my brief introduction to the work of Peter Szendy. I hope I produce some desire to read these books on infra-thin, on these barely perceptible entities, pursued always with proper passion. Okay, Peter.
Thank you Thank you so much, Mladen, for this very, very generous and thorough and attentive introduction. I'm very, very grateful and moved. Thank you also for inviting me to this festival. Thank you to the French Institute and to the Indigo Festival. I'm very honored and pleased to be here. I have always been a great admirer of Mladen's work, his book on voice, A Voice and Nothing More, from 2006. I also have a vivid memory of a talk that Mladen gave in Princeton in 2012, and it was on den. Den is a Greek word that means, but it's a hapax, actually. It occurred, as Mladen explained in his talk, only once or a few times, only once. And basically it means not nothing, but almost nothing. So in a way, you were talking about the infra-thin or the infra-slim too. And I guess then infra-thin, infra-slim, there are ways of talking about this kind of minimal difference that maybe we'll get back to in our discussion. And also I've been reading recently Mladen's essay on rumors that is soon to be published as a book, and I really look forward to it. So actually, when I started to imagine our dialogue this evening, and I was picturing in advance this moment, when we will be together on the stage, listening to one another, also later or right now listening to you, to your questions, to the more or less silent or noisy ways in which you could punctuate our discourses by breathing, coughing, laughing, etc. So when I anticipated in my mind this very situation we are in now, I thought, this was the first question that came to my mind, how many ears are involved? So I won't try to count, but one thing seems quite sure, it should be a multiple of 2. Ears, actually, in the act of listening, are supposed to work in pairs, by pairs, unless for some accidental reason they are unpaired. That is to say, they result maybe in a partial hearing impairment, as the English word goes. The English word impaired, by the way, has nothing to do with the notion of pair or pairing, but it comes from the same root as the French empirer, which means making worse or pejorate. In any case, it seems that there are no exceptions to the pairing of ears in the animal world, or maybe just one species I will say a word about. I've read recently, I began to be interested in this question of pairing of ears working in pairs. And I was curious, I've read a book edited by a neurobiologist from Cornell University, Ronald Hoy is his name. And in his introduction to this volume titled Comparative Hearing, Insects, that's the title of the volume, he writes the following that I want to quote. He says, if an animal has one ear, it has another. Ears come in pairs, one on each side of the head, in all vertebrates anyway. In mammals, one thinks of a pair of external fleshy appendages. In frogs or lizards, a pair of naked eardrums. In striking contrast, an insect's ears can be located virtually anywhere on its body, albeit also in pairs. Tympanal organs can be found in various locations, in its legs or its mouth parts, in its abdomen or its thorax, and even in its wings, but always two, right? Always in pair. But the only exception seems to be, I'm no specialist, but according to these neurobiologists, it seems to be the praying mantis. It's an insect that has attracted a lot of attention by surrealists, by Roger Caillois. So it seems that the praying mantis has what these neurobiologists have called, very interesting expression, a cyclopean ear, like the ear of a cyclop, one ear. Now, the very idea of such a cyclopean ear, actually in the praying mantis, it's located, if I understood correctly, on the ventral metathorax, so somewhere here. The very idea of a cyclopean ear is uncanny. Indeed, imagining a single ear, or more generally an odd number of ears, 1, 3, 5, is a highly disturbing and disorienting perspective. In one of Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories, maybe you know it, it's titled The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. It's a wonderful story. And in this story, the famous detective Sherlock Holmes has to solve a case that revolves around the enigma of 2 ears. So what happens is that Holmes and his famous assistant, Dr. Watson, learn in the newspaper that day that a certain Miss Cushing has been made the victim of what they think might be a joke, or maybe something much more sinister than a joke. The postman with the mail brought her a box with 2 human ears, I'm quoting from the story, apparently quite freshly severed, cut. And the enigma resides in the fact that, as Holmes observes, I quote, "The ears are not a pair." The ears are not a pair. So this is a really uncanny moment in the story. As the story goes, I quote, "One of these ears is a woman's, small, finely formed, and pierced for an earring, while the other is a man's, sunburned, discolored, and also pierced for an earring." But there's an even more uncanny moment, and it's when Holmes, who looks at Miss Cushing, the lady who receives the box with the 2 ears that don't form a pair, he looks at Miss Cushing and he notices, I quote, that her ear corresponded exactly with the female ear in the box, the severed ear. So after the uncanniness of 2 ears in a box that don't form a pair, the reader of this short story is faced with an even more fantastic and troubling possibility, because if the ear in the box is the same as Miss Cushing's, who is standing in front of Holmes with her pair of ears solidly glued to her head, how can it be? How can we even imagine that one of the unpaired ears in the box, what would it be? Her 3rd ear? So I won't tell more about this, what I'm tempted to call this autological, like the adjective for ears, this autological uncanny that Conan Doyle plays with throughout the story. I just want to say that it's not only an intriguing element for a good detective story, but actually the unpairing of ears, their odd number, 1, 3, etc., it's a recurring motif in some key moments when in the history of Western thought, listening is at stake. For example, in 1881 in a fragment titled Conversation About Music, that is part of Daybreak. Nietzsche stages two characters in a dialogue. He refers to them as A and B. They have no names, just A and B, and they talk about music and listening to music. And B says to A, I quote, "I have 2 ears and more if need be." And a little later, in his famous preface to Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche describes himself this time as, I quote, "someone with ears even behind his ears." So we don't know if it's an odd number or an even number, but there are supernumerary ears. Beyond Nietzsche, but actually borrowing from him, we find the third ear playing a very prominent role in a book by psychoanalyst Theodor Reich, who was one of Freud's first students in Vienna. After emigrating to the United States when he fled Nazism, Theodor Reich published Listening with the Third Ear in 1949. And in the chapter within the book, the chapter that repeats the title of the book, within the book, the chapter is titled The Third Ear, Reich explicitly refers to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, when he writes, and I quote Reich, "The psychoanalyst has to learn how one mind speaks to another beyond words and in silence. He must learn to listen with the third ear." End of quote. And 2 pages later, Reich compares this third ear with the inner ear, the ear which is also written in the singular. Right? The inner ear is also odd in number. Like the third ear, the inner ear cannot be paired. It has no match, and as such, it is monstrous, says Reich, whom I quote again. Reich says, "No doubt the third ear, of which we often speak, will appear to many not only as an anatomical, but also as a psychological abnormality, even to psychologists. But do we not speak of hearing with the inner ear?" End of quote. So I guess that by inner ear, Reich is referring to sounds that we hear from the inside without any external cause, like the inner speech that we often hear in our heads when we read. And Mladen already alluded to this question of the reading voice that we hear. I will get back to it very soon. Or maybe Reich is alluding to a long religious tradition that found its paradigmatic formulation in Augustine's recurring phrase in Augustine's Confessions, that is to say, the ears or the ear, both forms coexist in Augustine's Confession, singular and plural, the ears or the ear of the heart. These words in Latin, auris cordis, which is singular, or aures cordis, which is plural, these words are everywhere in Augustine's Confessions. I just take 2 samples, so to speak, but you could find many, many more. One is in Book 4, Chapter 5. Augustine writes, I quote, "May I apply the ear of my heart unto thy mouth, aurem cordis mei ori tuo." And in the same book a little later, and now in the plural, Augustine evokes, I quote, "the corporeal fictions that were resonating in the ears of my heart, cordis mei auribus," disturbing him, he says, while he was trying to hear what he calls the inward melody of truth. So in both cases, the ear of my heart or the ears of my heart, there are these odd or even number of ears turned inwards. But getting back to the third ear that Reich is talking about, Reich actually suggests that contrary to the inner ear that Augustine is talking about, the third ear, Reich says, can be directed, it can be strained to hear either inward or outward. Let me quote Reich again. He says, one of the peculiarities of this third ear is that it works two ways. It can catch what other people do not say, but only feel and think, and it can also be turned inward. It can hear voices from within the self that are otherwise not audible because they are drowned out by the noise of our conscious thought processes. End of quote. So the third ear is not only attuned to the other, it is also attuned to otherness, I would say, and both without and within. Now, let me go back also briefly to Nietzsche's conversation on music, that I quoted before in Daybreak, and to one passage in this conversation when the third ear is mentioned by B, one of the two dialogists, in his response to A. B says, I've quoted this, I have two ears and more if need be. So what happens in this exchange between two listeners is actually not simply an exchange between two about what they are hearing, that is to say, music. Actually, what goes on in this kind of listening stage that Nietzsche has orchestrated, and it's a generic listening stage. The people on this stage, A and B, they have no names, so it could be any of us, actually. It's like a diagram, almost like an abstract structure. What happens in this listening scene is not a monologue, of course, because there are two characters involved, A and B. But it is not exactly what we could call a duologue. It's a word that has been used since the 19th century. So not exactly a conversation involving two, because, well, at least one of the characters, B, has more than two ears. So B counts more than one. But it's not exactly what we could call a trialogue involving three, because this additional or supernumerary ear is unpaired. It's odd in numbers. So you cannot attribute it to a third participant, right? So it's not a monologue, not a duologue, and not a trialogue. I want to suggest that it is quite simply a dialogue, provided that we listen closely and attentively to this prefix, dia, because contrary to what we often think, dia is, it doesn't mean two in dialogue. Right? Dia means many things in Greek. It means through, it means across, it means between, also in different directions, in separate directions. So what I want to suggest, I guess, is that Nietzsche's conversation on music with A and with B having one more ear, or two more, or three more, we don't know. It's a dialogue precisely in the sense that at least one of the participants, and probably the two of them, are split, if you wish. Right? Each of them is one, but more than one, as a listener. Now, I want to suggest a word in order to name this supernumerary listening position that is this third ear. The name I want to suggest is it doesn't exist in English, neither in French, but it's very simple, and I'm surprised actually that it doesn't exist. The name is listenee, the listenee. So of course we always talk about the listener, the person who listens. But as I'm sure you know from the lexicon of postal correspondence or from the lexicon of narratology, if you send a letter, you send it to an addressee, right, with EE at the end of the word, the addressee. So the listenee is the one, the ear, or the agency to which or to whom listening is addressed. And I guess what I want to suggest with this kind of drifting meditation on the number of ears is that there is always one more ear, because this is the place of the listenee. And the listenee, whoever or whatever the listenee is the condition of possibility of listening. Without a listenee, no listener would be listening. Hearing, maybe, as Mladen suggested, as you said in your introduction, entendre or ouïr in French maybe, but écouter probably not. So I don't want to take too long, but just briefly, after having considered how listening is, I would say, split, right? B has 2 ears and 1 more, if need be. So B is not exactly 2, but is not exactly 1 either. Listening is split or triangulated, if you wish, by this third ear. How listening hence becomes dialogically differentiated, because it is always directed both towards what is to be heard and towards the listenee, right? That's why it's triangulated. I would like to briefly go back again to what Theodor Reich, after Augustine and others, has called the inner ear. What this inner ear or inner pair of ears listen to, I was saying, could be the inner speech that we often hear in our heads, for example, when we read. Now, there is a word in English which is very rarely used and almost unknown, a word that designates the one to whom or for whom something is being read aloud. One of the very rare occurrences of this word is in the correspondence of an American historian. I'm sure you don't know him. His name is William Hickling Prescott, first half of the 19th century, and he suffered from serious vision problems, and he was forced actually to appeal to a reader in order to be able to read. So he had to ask someone to read for him. So it means that actually reading for him meant to listen to someone reading. And he needed this person to read for him because he was doing research on the history of Spain, a lot of archival reading. And in the summer of 1827, he wrote to his biographer the following lines, I quote, "My excellent reader reads to me in Spanish with a genuine Castilian accent 2 hours a day without understanding a word." And then later in the same letter to his biographer, the historian adds, in the form of a question to his biographer, "Which would you rather be, reader or readee?" Which would you rather be, reader or reedy? And it's interesting because this is 1827, and the word reedy is in italics, so it really signals that it's a lexical invention. I'm not sure if this is the first time that the word is used in English, but it's certainly a very early usage. Actually, the word is rarely used in English. Sometimes in tarot, when reading cards, people say distinguish the reader, the one who reads the cards, for someone who's the reedy. But what I find interesting is precisely the fact that this word, though it exists, it is so rarely used. And I can't help seeing this rare usage as a symptom. Because the habit that we have of considering reading exclusively as a mute and as an inward practice, this habit pushes us to basically conflate the one whose voice reads and the one who listens, right? And we conflate the two in the generic term reader. I tend to think that when I'm reading, I tend to think that both positions, both agencies are mine. It is I who read for myself. I am the reader and the reedy at the same time. And hence, the position of the reedy disappears. It is diluted and it loses the specificity of its role. But this is actually very strange and surprising because for a very long time in the history of reading in the West, a distinction was made between readers and readies. Even if readies didn't yet have a name for what they were doing, for their action, which seems rather to have been thought as a kind of passion or passive receptivity. For example, this is a famous example, but I like it. In the dedication of his fourth book, Rabelais recalls that the late King François I, who died shortly before, he was listening to a clear reading of Rabelais' book, read by, I quote, the eloquent voice of the most learned and faithful anagnost of this kingdom, anagnost. So this is another interesting word, symmetrical to the reedy, the one for whom something is read. The anagnost is actually a Greek word inherited from Greco-Roman antiquity. The anagnost, or anagnostes in Greek, was the slave reader who read for others. A slave specialized in reading aloud. There is a beautiful letter by Cicero, for example, to his friend Atticus, where Cicero writes, I quote, "My reader," and reader here is anagnostes, Sositeus was his name, "my reader, a charming fellow, has died. I am more upset about it than anyone would suppose that I should be about a slave's death." So the reader, the slave who read aloud, was such a special role in a world that was based on slavery that Cicero is actually moved, even though he is not supposed to be so moved by the death of those who were considered slaves. But I just want to mention maybe the most interesting and most thought-provoking example of reading aloud by an anagnostes in Greek antiquity, and it is in one of Plato's dialogues. Maybe you know it. It's the dialogue titled Theaetetus. It's a dialogue about knowledge, basically. And it's a dialogue that fails. It's one of these dialogues where in the end, they don't reach any satisfying conclusions. They being Socrates, Theodorus, and Theaetetus. So it's a trialogue, if you wish. But this trialogue is the body of the text. But before that, there is a prologue, as often there is in Plato's dialogues. And the prologue, where we don't meet the characters yet. So you don't, in the prologue, there is no Socrates, no Theodorus, no Theaetetus, but there are two characters who then leave the stage, Euclid and Terpsion. And they talk, they remember what Socrates used to say, etc. And one of them, I don't remember which one, says, I took notes of what Socrates said. And so they basically decide that they want to read these notes. And what they do is that they address, at the end of the prologue, before the dialogue proper begins, they address someone, but someone who doesn't even have a name, someone who doesn't even say a word in his own name, which he doesn't have. They address this agency, I don't know how to call him, probably him, not her, with the following words: boy, pai in Greek, boy, take the book, biblion, which was at the time a scroll, take the book and read, lege in Greek. And so these are the last words of the prologue. And then the dialogue proper begins with Socrates, Theodorus, and Theaetetus. And so what happens, which is, it's never, usually we don't pay attention to what happens here. And the many, many comments on this dialogue, which has been commented upon so much, no one really pays attention to this moment. What happens is that what we read about knowledge, Socrates' voice, Theodorus, Theaetetus, they are all read aloud by this reading slave, who was the anagnostes. So while we read the dialogue proper, we are actually being read, as modern readers, we are actually being read to by the enslaved reader, the anagnostes. So there would be a lot to say about what this is my hypothesis actually, what we inherit from these ancient reading scenes like this one, when we, modern and silent and solitary readers, when we read today. And maybe we can return to this in our discussion, also with all of you. This is where I would locate something that I'm tempted to call the politics, that is to say the power relations inherent to reading. So not politics of reading in the usual sense of the expression, as in French it's very widespread, les politiques de la lecture, meaning politics in favor of reading in order to support reading practices, etc. But politics of reading in the sense of politics inherent to the very act of reading. There is a slave, there are power relations, there is this reading imperative that Mladen mentioned. And basically my hypothesis is that when reading has become mainly silent, or so-called, what happens is not that anagnostes and readies disappear, but somehow we interiorize this scene. So when we read silently, there is an anagnostis, there is a ready within us. So maybe I don't want to take too long, so I'll conclude. Since I have begun this talk by wondering about the number of ears, right? 2 plus 1, or minus 1, 3 or 1, and specifically about supernumerary ears. right? That is to say, about the multiplication of ears beyond what we think or observe. I want to conclude by mentioning briefly something that we will certainly discuss, mentioning briefly another tradition that pertains to listening, that is to say, the history of visual representations of envy, calumny, and more specifically, rumor. And I would like to ask the people who take care of techniques if you could project the image that I brought. This image with
okay.
Yes, thank you. So I will tell you in a moment. Can we see? Yes. What interests me is the stick that one of these three allegorical characters is holding in her hand, a stick which is covered with ears. And I will tell you in a moment what this is. But just in order to understand where this comes from, I have to recall that rumor or hearsay, which is something we have both worked on, as Mladen said, without actually knowing about each other's work, which is a kind of telepathy that we seem to have, and which is very, it brings me a lot of joy. It's not very often that there is telepathy in this sense, in what is called academia. Usually the contrary happens. Either people don't want to hear about each other's work, or if they do, it's in a much more fraught and complicated relationship, and not with this kind of spontaneous, like a spontaneous event, because I believe we really didn't know about each other's work when we wrote on rumors. Anyway, so I just want to recall that in Virgil's Aeneid, the personification of fama in Latin, which means both fame and also rumor or hearsay, is described in the following terms. I quote very briefly from Aeneid. Fast on her feet, and being fast is very important. I'm sure we will go back to this. Fast on her feet and provided with wings of astonishing power, huge and horrendous, a monster whose body conceals beneath feathers, so the monster has feathers, just the same number of spying eyes and of ears pricked to eavesdrop. So as many ears as there are feathers on her wings, right? This is fama. And obviously this representation of I will tell you what this is an allegory of, but obviously it comes from this tradition that began with Virgil. This image is taken from a French illuminated manuscript from the end of the 15th or beginning of 16th century. And actually what you see is Envy. Envy who has these prosthetic eyes. Envy who carries on her back treason. And treason holds a kind of poison, right? And detraction, détraction in French. Detraction, I think the word exists in English. It means, to speak badly about something. It's sort of equivalent of calumny, I believe. And so it's detraction, or calumny, if you prefer, who is holding in her hand this stick full of ears. And I just want to quote, and I will stop here, the text. This is, as I was saying, an illuminated manuscript. And the text of the manuscript The manuscript is actually the prose version or adaptation of a very well-known 14th century poem that was titled Pèlerinage de la vie humaine, that is to say, pilgrimage of human life, or human life as a pilgrimage. And it was, on the theme of Homo viator, so man as a traveler who goes through life like a pilgrim. And on his way, the pilgrim encounters many allegorical characters. So this is one of the scenes. And the manuscript describes these scenes with words, and the illuminations show the scenes. So for this scene, we read that the allegorical figure of detraction, I quote both in French and English, uses her hooked sword. Elle se sert de son glaive crossu. This is Old French. Her sword, but with hooks, right? Uses her hooked sword to skewer people's ears, embrocher les oreilles des gens, like a skewer, where you put meat to roast meat, to skewer people's ears and make a puree, like a mashed nutrient, for her mother, envy, pour en faire coulis. That was the old French word used at the time, coulis, which is like a coulis, but at the time it meant more like a puree. À sa mère, envie. So what I find really striking is this idea, this image of embrocher les oreilles, to skewer ears. And I thought it would be a nice allegory, image, suggestion to start our discussion on rumors. Right? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. It was a sort of vintage Peter Szendy, in some sense, giving this very precise aperçu of taken from all parts of history, which nevertheless form a very firm red thread. The sort of analysis, disentangling phenomenology of listening and the ears. And I will just first make a comment on Theodor Reich. Listening with the Third Ear was quite a famous book on psychoanalysis, and what Theodor Reich argued for is that this is what psychoanalysis is about. When the psychoanalyst needs a third ear, this is the epitome of what a psychoanalytic listening should be. But Lacan, actually in Seminar 11, he refers to this book and makes rather caustic remark, saying that listening with the third ear, as if 2 ears were not enough to be deaf. Like, okay, 2 ears are already enough to be deaf. We don't need a third ear for this. And what he actually argues for is not, as opposed to Reich. And Reich was, by the way, the one psychoanalyst who wrote very proficiently about music, actually the only one who was seriously into the psychoanalysis of music. And Lacan's argument is not that we need an addition, a +1 ear, but actually we need a subtraction. We need a subtraction from, and I was briefly mentioned this opposition between écouter and entendre. We need the subtraction of entendre. We need the subtraction of making sense. So we must subtract trying to make sense from what we hear in psychoanalysis, so that we arrive at what Freud called the gleichschwebende Aufmerksamkeit, which means the evenly distributed attention. The evenly distributed attention which pays equal attention to things which make sense or are important, and to things which seemingly don't make sense or are just side effects or lacunas or whatever. So Lacan's point was trying to... Gardez-vous de comprendre. This is one of his famous slogans. Don't try to understand. Don't try to understand. Well, what psychoanalysis is about, you have to subtract understanding and making sense in order to properly listen. So he somehow opposed this idea that you need an additional ear. You need to subtract something from the usual listening in order to be a psychoanalyst. This was his argument. A very brief argument against Theodor Reich, whom he appreciated, by the way, because his writing on shofar was very essential for Lacan.
This is, may I just jump in very quickly?
Yeah, sure.
This is so interesting because, in a way, so I had forgotten about this this passage in Lacan's seminar that you're recalling, but my feeling is that what this is about is the oscillation between one more and one less.
Yes.
So between 3 and 1, and somehow as if the important thing were the odd number, right? So the fact that somehow, maybe I'm going too quickly here, but somehow the even number of ears would be about gathering, understanding maybe, but the odd number, there is a dissymmetry, an asymmetry. There is something that opens up that doesn't, how do you say in English? It's not totaled, gathered in unity. And so this is what psychoanalytic listening should be about. I don't mean to reconcile at all costs Lacan and Reich, but that's how I
No, I'm with you. I think that listening with 2 ears is maybe not the good thing. We should pursue this +1 and -1 as a proper way to get to the kind of listening we are after. And that there has to be this. This is one thing. There is another thing. I would just briefly mention that in German you actually have this difference between Leser and Anleser. Because Leser is a reader, but Anleser is someone who reads to other people. And there was this famous novel with great success, Bernhard Schlink, The Anleser, the Reader. There was a film with Kate Winslet, etc., etc. So, where the difference between lesen and unlesen is essential. Now, what I wanted to ask you about is you developed very beautifully this argument about the internalized anagnostes. Like you had this slave that was reading to this audience of aristocrats or whatever. So this was slave business to read out loud. And in the whole history of reading, there was a very long period where actually loud reading was the standard. It's only late, actually, that interiorized reading, late Middle Ages, interiorized reading took over. So your contention is that the internal voice you deal with in reading is actually our internal anagnostes. It is an atavistic remainder of the internalized remainder of this situation of the slave reading to the masters, as it were. So we are both masters and slaves, and we have to somehow interiorate the slave in order to be seemingly the master. And my question is, I briefly touched upon this in the introduction, that what happens with the hypertext? You describe the situation of the hypertext, this absolute overproduction, overwhelming production of texts. We are at all times we are scrolling our screens on the smartphones, so on computers. We are constantly, there's so much text around as has never been in the history of humanity. So we are somehow confronted with this overflow of reading, but an overflow which actually stifles reading, the very capacity of reading? And does it stifle the capacity of inner voice? Is the inner voice still possible? You speak in the book about a bit enigmatically about the reinvention of the inner voice in hypertext. That one would have to stick to the notion of the inner voice as the most valuable notion in reading. But it will have to be completely reshaped and reinvented in this situation of this flood of hypertext. What do you mean by this? How do you imagine this to happen?
Yeah, thank you for the question, which is, I think, a crucial question for all of us who read. And when I say all of us who read, I don't mean necessarily specialized readers whose work or job, I hate this word job, it is to read, but all of us reading hypertexts all the time. So the idea I ended up with, working on all these materials from the history of reading, ancient materials, but also modern, contemporary materials. Some authors like Paul Valéry, whom I pay attention to in the book, who was... sorry?
And Blanchot.
And Blanchot, yes, and Michel de Certeau. Paul Valéry was really upset by the overwhelming amount of things that there are to read, and by the acceleration of reading. He said in his notebooks, he keeps going back to the idea that the modern reader doesn't read but guesses. So he's not a reader, but he doesn't. Il ne lit pas, mais il devine. So and this Valéry saw as a shift in reading from the vocality of reading towards a purely visual kind of scanning of the page. So and of course for Valéry there is a nostalgia involved in this, like how reading used to be beautiful and skillful, etc. But with all these modern visual stimuli, reading has lost basically its patience, its art, etc. So I don't want to go neither into the nostalgic thing nor into the techno-enthusiastic thing, but what interests me is the idea that basically vocality in reading is a question of speed. And this I find very interesting. It's actually not only in Valéry, but if you look at scientific studies, like neuroscience about reading, which I usually don't do, but for some reason I looked at neuroscientific readings about reading. So what happens is that what neuroscientists call subvocalization, which is not really not a voice proper, but stimulation of the cerebral zones that have to do with vocality, some kind of stimulation of vocal cords, though they don't really vibrate. So this subvocalization increases when the speed of reading slows down, and it fades away, this vocality, when the speed of reading increases. Okay, so that's what interests me even more precisely is the idea that in the end, vocalizing when we read, it's the expression of a tension or of basically a speed differential. Right? So you have the text, you go through the text at a certain speed, but this speed is contrary to what neuroscientific studies or or so-called speed reading training makes you believe, the speed of reading is never one, actually. You don't go through a text with one speed, as you would think. Even on the internet, you have training machines. Like there is one you can try. It's very, very funny. It's called Spreeder, like speed reader, and it trains you to to read more and more quickly. But the real question is that there is not one speed in reading. You go through the text at a certain speed and at the same time at another speed. And somehow, what I mean is that if it's true, as I believe, that as readers we are split between, and I'm getting to your question, between an agency that, let's say, reads aloud for ourselves, and a position, an agency that listens to this vocalization of the text, then there are always these moments that we know very well. For example, I, as a reader, I read maybe too quickly a page in a book or a web page or anything, and I know that I have been reading it, but I didn't pay attention, right? So I've been reading it too quickly compared to myself, right? Not too quickly in absolute measure, but I have been reading it quicker than myself, right? So I tell myself, okay, slow down, read it again, and this time pay attention, that is to say, usually listen to the vocalization or sub-vocalization of what you are reading for yourself. So try to synchronize these two speeds, right? And I think that maybe this... So I try to answer your question in historical terms. I mean, I think that's the structure, right? But what happens is maybe this synchronization is increasingly difficult to produce, or this synchronization might be overwhelmed, or the speed differential has grown so much that somehow it's not even a differential anymore. I don't know. There is something like that going on, and which means that the reading self, which is a split self, right? It's the reading self. When I am reading, I'm always running after myself, right? Paying attention to what I'm reading. I'm reading this, but I didn't pay attention, so I'm reading it again, and I try to collect myself, right, in the very act of reading. And this reading self is maybe increasingly difficult for it to be itself, if a self is ever itself, right? Something like that.
If self is still a category. Yes. So I have another brief remark on the picture you were showing, the stick with so many ears, being the icon of the rumors. I would just mention that there's another visualization of this in Shakespeare's play Henry IV. In the beginning of the second part, you have a prologue which comes on stage and say, I am the rumor, I rumor speak. And then, yes, makes the rumor, proclamations of the rumor in the first person, this impossible sort of position of enunciation, because if anybody would take rumors upon him or herself, then they would cease to be rumors. But the stage indications say the actor comes on stage painted full of tongues. So you have one image, so many ears on this stick, and you have another image, so many tongues. I mean, well, what is a rumor? It's a proliferation of tongues and proliferation of ears, which somehow correspond, which iconographically belong together, I believe. I would finally, nevertheless, go back to, I mean, this is another way of asking my previous question, but I would go to the quote with which I finished, the Nancy quote, which I was surprised by Nancy quote. I mean, I have read it in your text on rumors, where he says, okay, fake news, all this proliferation, what's the fuss? This has always been the case. So he somehow seems a bit unconcerned or not really worried about this new situation, as opposed to me, I'm very worried. I'm extremely worried. I think rumors, of course, we share this, that rumors are the origin of human sociality at all. And there are actually interesting books like Robin Dunbar, I don't know if you know this, Grooming Gossip and the Origin of Language. It's wonderful. He makes the case that rumors and gossip are the zero function of language. This is how language emerged. And yes, I share this, but the level of rumorization, the level of fake news, the impossibility of distinction between the verifiable and unverifiable, unverified, distinction between decent and indecent, the distinction between relevant and irrelevant. I mean, the growing impossibility to draw some very basic distinctions, facts and opinions, or whatever. There is a background rumorization which has taken over. So there are these two positions. Me, who I'm very worried and anxious about this, and I think that we have reached a stage where something will implode or explode, or that it's impossible to maintain this kind of state. And then Jean-Luc Nancy sort of saying very coolly, but this has always been the case. I mean, why would we need to worry, actually? Fake news has always been around in vast quantities. Everything is being said, and it's contrary. It's okay, sort of. What do you think about these two possible points of view on this new? Is it a new situation we are facing, or is it a situation as old as mankind, only taking a sort of new forms and new avatars? And I'm rather on the side of seeing this as the quantity, actually, the sheer quantity and the speed of the proliferation of information, communication, rumors, everything, is actually on the verge of the emergence of a new kind of state of affairs, which is uncomparable to anything that went before in the history of humanity. What would be your take on this?
So I tend to... I was surprised too, actually, when I read these comments that Jean-Luc Nancy made. So I have to say that they are part of... They were made in a discussion after one of these lectures that he gave for a very young audience, an audience of children, but also with adults in the room. And there was a discussion afterwards. Maybe it was a lecture on truth, I believe. And so in the discussion, maybe it's something that he said quickly, but still, you know, I think it has to be taken seriously. And it surprises me a lot. And I tend to be, like you, worried. And beyond the fact that I'm worried or not, which is not so interesting, but I tend to think that there is a whole new era in what rumor even means. And so that's why when I read your piece, your chapter, titled On Rumors, Gossip and Related Matters, in a wonderful book, an edited book by Alenka Zupancic and someone else, I think. The book is called Objective Fictions. And one of your arguments, which I find really, really so thought-provoking and compelling, actually, is so you place it under the sign of Kafka, and Kafka's The Trial, which is, by the way, how we met in Zagreb.
In Zagreb, many years ago, yes.
We were part of a festival that was partly dedicated to Orson Welles' filmic adaptation of
The shooting of the trial in Zagreb, actually.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so you quote the beginning, the incipit of Kafka's The Trial, which I can't quote by memory, by heart, maybe.
Somebody must have been spreading rumors against Joseph K.
Yes. And so what you say, and this seems to me, maybe this captures a kind of jump or something that radically changed. So you talk about meta rumors, if I remember correctly, right? And so not only is Joseph K. the object of rumors, but this very sentence, somebody must have spread rumors. So rumors are themselves the object of rumors. Somebody must have spread rumors about, right? And so there is somehow the very oppositionality between rumors and truth, which has always existed, with an imbalance for the one or for the other, and this is not new. But the fact that this meta rumor is sort of taking over, right? This maybe radically changes something. I mean, I would really follow your suggestion.
Rather the worried part than the sort of unconcerned
yes.
part.
Yes, absolutely. And so, so I think that now I'm contradicting myself, because if you think of the image that we saw, all these keyword ears, I see it as anticipating something of this proliferation, right? This unheard of proliferation of listening to rumors that we are witnessing. So, but saying that this anticipates is not exactly the same as saying that it has always been the case, right? So we can read in an anachronistic way, read back into an image like this, something that anticipates our contemporary situation, but it doesn't mean that at the time and now rumors are all the same and they have always been the same. I would really go with you seeing, a new era of rumors. Yeah.
We have a monitor there saying that we have only 2 minutes left, and we must open the floor to the questions from the audience.
A bo kdo kaj vprašal? Evo. Alenka?
Yeah, thank you very much for this. This was really fascinating. And actually, I don't have a question, but more like a small, perhaps funny contribution to what you said. This question of the third year, I remembered from the time when I was myself working on Nietzsche, that actually there is this expression as such does occur in Nietzsche, the third year. And I just quickly used these modern reading devices and I Googled it, and I find at least one instance which is really, really funny, from Beyond Good and Evil. And I will read it to you because I think it deserves to be read. What a torture are books written in German for the man who has a third ear. How reluctantly he stands beside the slowly revolving swamp of sounds without melody, of rhythms without dance, what among blah, and so on and so on. So, but I would even say that there is another, at least one more instance when he kind of prizes himself with having a third ear or something like this. But I thought this was funny because what a torture. Sometimes it is to have a third ear. Yeah.
Particularly with German.
Yeah, but I guess there are other situations or languages where it could also be a torture. Perhaps analysis is one of them. I don't think it's always extremely pleasant to listen with a third ear to what is being said.
This is very interesting because it is often quoted, this occurrence of the expression the third ear. and I mean, in the context of our discussion, it's interesting that it's about reading, right? So, well,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Mladen and Peter. One thing that I think anyone who thinks about music or is a musician often asks oneself is, how do we think about music without making an analogy with vision? And what is the différent between one and the other? And I think that, aside from the fact that philosophers are terribly educated about music, and often, if musicians at all bad, such as Nietzsche, the analogy is so strong for some kind of deep structural reason that it's very difficult to break out of these. I mean, for example, the cycloptic ear of the praying mantis, but also even panacoustikon, now that might be a historical function rather than a straightforward analogy, but nonetheless, we're wont to make those sorts of analogies. And the interesting thing about, was it Prescott, the name of the historian? About this case is that, of course, the reedy only comes to fruition as a result of him being effectively blind. So in some sense, there is no reedy as distinct from a reader unless one is blind. There's no necessity, at least, for it to be, that difference to be manifest. Not that it isn't always there as an invariant among us. And so it does pose the question of whether this is one way to formulate the difference, that we don't have a viewee, so to speak, that there's what makes something visible or imaginary, in Mladen's terms, which he's emphasized multiple times, makes sense, is that there's an immediate coincidence between my viewing and what is viewed, even organically. It's an immediate reflection, as opposed to, say, the tympan, as the famous beginning of dissémination, right? Something has to re-say or rewrite or enregistrer, which is a fantastic way of putting it, record what I'm listening to. And so I pose the question to you, do you think, Peter and Mladen, there is a viewee, or can we say that this is a genuine différent between seeing and listening? Thank you.
Shall I begin?
Yes.
Oh, thank you for this wonderful question. Very challenging. A quick answer, but it would really deserve a very long answer. A quick answer, which actually is connected to this festival in Zagreb, where we met. So when I went to Zagreb, I talked about Orson Welles' filmic adaptation of Kafka's The Trial. And at a certain point in Orson Welles' film, Orson Welles, who is himself in the film, acts as one of these figures, characters, or roles that were so common in early cinema. People who, with silent films, with subtitles, intertitles, with titles, someone would stand on the side of the screen and maybe read these titles aloud for the audience who didn't know how to read. But much more than that, this film lecturer, as they call it in English, or bonimenteur, as he was called in French, was basically commenting the film all the time. And there are many accounts of the work of this film lecturer or bonimenteur, for example, with a stick, showing basically and telling the story for the audience while the film was going on, and with the stick pointing here and there, etc. So this pointing function, right, here, there, which is a kind of visual punctuation of what is going on. And I tend to think, but this is a very short answer, that this has to do with what I would imagine as a same but different, for different reasons and in different terms, but as also a triangulated, let's say, field when it comes to seeing, to viewing. And I would say that there is a viewee. So, but this is way too short an answer. But I would say that if we can think of a difference between, in French, between voir and regarder, which would be the same kind of intensification that you have between entendre or ouïr and écouter, right? If we have this same kind of difference when it comes to regarder, that is to say, viewing or seeing with an intention, complicated word, then I would say that there is a kind of addressee that, why not, we could call, I love the term, viewee. I don't know if it exists, but it would deserve some inquiry. Thank you.
I have a monitor there which blinks in red and saying that we are almost 7 minutes over time.
But I think you should say something.
Shall we allow for one more question quickly?
But you don't want to you don't want to say something. Be curious.
To respond to this, let me think it over. No, it would have to do with the question of, yes, regarder et voir, and the question of le regard, the gaze, which, I mean, this is why I rather hesitate to go into all this. I mean, the gaze and the voice are for Lacan the object. And the way that this function is that the gaze is inscribed into the objectivity that we are facing. So we usually in regarder we presuppose that we are here and there is the visual world over there, standing in front of us. And now the regard, the gaze being an object itself, that would be the inscription of the gaze into what we are seeing. And this would be, I think, the beginning of an answer to what a viewee is. The short circuit between the gaze in front of which we see the visual world and the gaze which is described in the visual world itself. The short circuit between the two. That would be maybe the lever to start on the question of viewee.
Yes, here.
One last question, okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I would like to return to the spatial implications of the term dia etymologically, particularly if it interests you in view of Kant's theory of the incongruent counterparts, and thinking of the pairing of the ears or of various symmetries of the body and the body plan as being constituted actually not by these pairings being two of a kind, but rather singular, absolutely incompatible differences that are transcendentally kind of determined, you can say. And I would think, particularly as the question of perceptual immediacy was brought up so eloquently, it would be interesting to reflect on Kant's very ingenuine transformation of the mere Newtonian fixing of positions, which is what the material externality of vision kind of leads us to believe. And in returning to hearing as a kind of mode of immediate spatial orientation, not just positionality, so as a form of, I mean, he calls it orientation and thinking. And so if there may not be like an etymological connection between hearing and the gerund, like hearing, to be here, dabei sein, but there might be like, even the homophony is sort of interesting, that to hear is to also to a mode of being present thoughtfully and orientedly rather than just a kind of being hit with like sonorous vibrations and so on. And also thinking of sound as kind of an external, or rather an extended step of material presencing in the sense that, in Hegel's sense, that the sound always returns back to itself. It's never a mere externalization. It kind of reverberates and so on. So I just wanted to kind of point to that. And also, it's inspired by this tendency to critique the quantitative aspect of this question. And I think if you bring in Kant, it might pose maybe a formal limit on the idea of the supernumerary years or so. I mean, there's already a kind of a unification, a synthesis that is immanent in any kind of fractionation or differentiation. That's my point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So there are so many things in your question, comment that would deserve to paths that would deserve to be followed. Just very quickly, one thought, since you talked about space and orientation, and this connects also to the previous question. The way we orient ourselves in space through hearing, it's thanks to what is known as what's the term? Differential hearing. So the fact that waves, sound waves, they reach the two ears with a slight difference, microseconds. But this slight difference, this differential hearing, is responsible for the sense of orientation in space. And for example, people who lose hearing in one ear, they tend to lose this spatial orientation. I know it. Someone very close to me has almost lost her hearing in one ear, and she very often thinks that, this is coming from here, whereas it's coming from here. And so I think that this is one way of thinking about what we have been discussing, right? The pairing of ears, the number of ears, even when there are two, or maybe precisely when there are two, actually what is at stake is something that makes these two somehow uneven, right, or odd in their very pairing, and this is how spatiality opens up for the sense of hearing.
I think I really have to stop.
Yeah, thank you, Mladen Dolar and Peter Szendy. Thank you very much.